You know by now that we're all about the journey. June's journey, that is. I feel this game was made for us specifically. It's the closest I've come to feeling like I've been dropped in the middle of a mystery novel set in the 1920s.
That's because you get to play as June, a globe-trotting flapper/amateur sleuth who lives to solve mysteries. You get to visit all sorts of fascinating places, from Paris to Cuba. You beat levels by identifying hidden objects in the scene. And we found that the more we play, the sharper our observational skills become.
The game is delightful, and a wonderful way to relax. I'll often pull my phone out and play it when I've got a free moment, like I'm on hold with an archive, or I'm waiting for a courthouse to open up in the morning. I'm currently on Chapter 16, meaning I'm searching for the son of June's housekeeper, who's on the run from New Orleans gamblers and the police. It's a wild time.
We know our audience is filled with folks who love a good mystery. Now is your chance to try your hand at being a sleuth yourself. Discover your inner detective when you download June's Journey for free today on iOS and Android. Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder.
Since we last covered the quadruple homicide at the University of Idaho, there have been a number of pretty big developments in the case against Bryan Kohberger, who of course is the man charged with brutally killing Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogen, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. Namely, the two big developments that we want to talk about today include information around the DNA evidence in the case, as well as the prosecution's intent to seek the death penalty. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, the Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is the University of Idaho Murders, the Death Penalty, and DNA. So, as we mentioned, there have been a lot of filings in this case throughout June. This has been a situation where both the prosecution and the defense have been quite busy making their filings, counter motions, whatnot. Now, one thing I want to note is that we're going to do a whole separate episode on the gag order that involves not only the defense and prosecution, but also the family of Kaylee Gonsalves and the media representatives who are covering this case. And that to me is a somewhat interesting issue given our own experience with the gag order in Delphi and just looking at gag orders in general. So I wanted to do just maybe put all that to the side now. We're not going to talk about that in this episode. That'll be its own thing. What we're going to do is kind of look at all the other stuff that's happened so far in Idaho recently since our last update. So one big thing that has come up is the use of investigative genetic genealogy.
So what does that mean? What is investigative genetic genealogy?
Well, I think a lot of our listeners who consume a lot of true crime media actually probably have a pretty good understanding of this. And I'm going to really dumb it down because I am not a scientist and this is just basically how I understand it. A DNA profile is collected related to a crime. And then that is uploaded onto a public site known as GEDmatch, where basically people upload their DNA profiles, oftentimes in an attempt to kind of build out their family trees or see, if they're an adoptee, see who they're related to biologically. It's all these different uses. And investigators look at the offender's profile and see if they can build out any relatives. And so if they're seeing, okay, second cousin, this is person, like based on the DNA results and the level of match here, we're seeing this person is a second cousin to our offender, most likely. And then they basically have to go back and build up a family tree using traditional genealogy resources in order to identify the offender. So it's basically what happens when they have this profile, but it doesn't match anyone in their system. And it's a great use of technology because it's led to the closing of quite a lot of cold cases that I'm sure we're all familiar with, like the Golden State Killer and whatnot. Prior to this, it would be somewhat difficult to identify somebody if they weren't already in the system. And this all underscores the fact that we know that Idaho is a DNA case.
And we know that, of course, because that was pretty clearly set out in the PCA, that some DNA, which was identified as Bryan Kohberger, was found on the sheath of a knife that was left at the crime scene.
Exactly. Now, maybe, Kevin, you can talk us through, different types of DNA at a scene in the sense that, like, what's super useful and what's perhaps less so.
I think one of the big things to consider in terms of DNA left at a scene is where exactly is this scene? Is it a place that is relatively private, that only a few people could be expected to access? Or is it a place where a lot of people come through? For instance, we've done a lot of restaurant crimes.
Yes.
A lot of restaurant murders. If you find some DNA on the front counter of a restaurant, that may not really help in identifying a killer because over the course of a day, hundreds of people likely go into the restaurant and touch that counter. Now, if on the other hand, to continue with the example of the restaurant murders, if you find some DNA on the safe in the manager's office and it does not belong to the manager, well, you'd have to ask yourself, who else could have a reason to touch this safe? And so that becomes more interesting if the DNA belongs to someone who doesn't really have a reason to be there.
So context can help us sort out who it can be proven to have been in the house versus who can be linked to the murders.
Yes. I think it's also important to consider what the DNA is recovered from. Again, if I'm finding something on the counter of the restaurant, let's say I find a spoon on the counter of the restaurant. That's something that could have been left there by any number of customers. But let's say I find a gun on the counter of a restaurant, or a knife, or something that was actually definitely used in the commission of the crime. If the DNA is found on something that has no reason to be there other than to be used in the commission of a crime, that's also more significant.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to have to be keeping that in mind going forward, because one sort of, somewhat bombshell sounding revelation from some of these recent filings is that, and recent hearings, is that other male DNA was found, in the house, which of course is this crime scene. And the defense is going to be looking to that to be saying, hey, these other people who left this male DNA here may be the real offenders. Maybe our guy is innocent. And of course, the prosecution is likely going to be looking at it from the perspective of there's possibly other more innocent explanations for additional DNA being at a scene, especially when it's a college house where people could be in and out and, coming in to say hi. If someone, for example, takes a sip out of a drink, leaves that on the counter and their DNA is in the saliva and that person is proven to be in the house, well, that tells us that he was in the house taking a drink. That could be significant. But it also seems highly significant about whose DNA is on the knife sheath used in the commission of the crime. So it's important to be open-minded, but I may be a little bit skeptical, I think.
Yes, and certainly we don't know about the lives of these students who were murdered because we didn't know them personally, but I think we've both been in college. We've both been in and out of houses at college where college students stay. I think they're frequently high traffic areas, people coming and going, even if it's just to pick up notes or something to help with class.
Yeah, it's exactly. And I think we've learned from some media reports in this case that, there were parties, there were different events going on at this house. It was not a situation where it would be described as some place that nobody ever visited who was not, directly living there. Now, one way in the actual court filings that the investigative genetic genealogy is actually coming into play here is because of a disagreement between the prosecution and the defense. So here's what's going on. I'll be reading from a filing from the Latah County prosecuting attorney. This case arises from a quadruple homicide. Law enforcement found the DNA of a potential suspect at the crime scene, and the FBI submitted the DNA to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to determine potential relatives of the suspect. The FBI then used common genealogical techniques to develop a family tree leading to defendant. The state seeks to protect from disclosure the names and personal information of the hundreds of innocent relatives on the family tree, the names of the publicly available genetic genealogy services used, and certain other information described below. The disclosure of this information is not required by Rule 16 of the Idaho Criminal Rules and should be protected from disclosure for the good cause described below, including the state's privilege to protect the identity of informers as described in Idaho Rule of Evidence 509. So what's all this about? What's going on? My understanding, and Kevin, correct me if you have a different interpretation of this, is just that basically the defense wants to get basically the entire genetic genealogy tree that was put together based on Kohberger's DNA. And what the prosecutor wants to do with this protective order is basically ensure that the names of random people who kind of came up in this through their work are not going to be put out there to the world, essentially.
Right.
So somebody who is so far away from Kohberger in terms of relation that they might not even know they're related.
So basically the prosecution is taking the position is we don't want to drag people into this who only have a peripheral at best connection to this just because they happen to share some similarity in their DNA.
Now, specifically, what do they want to protect? Well, they got into that.
Specifically, the state seeks to protect the following information: the raw data related to the SNP profile and the underlying laboratory documentation related to the development of the profile, such as chain of custody forms, laboratory standard operating procedures, analysis notes, etc. All information related to IGG efforts in creating a family tree and identifying defendants' potential relatives, including the identities of the genetic genealogy services and the personally identifying information of defendants' relatives. The state does not seek to protect and has or will disclose the following information: a genotype kit report from the private lab utilized by the Idaho State Police, which documents that a DNA test was performed. Information related to the STR DNA analysis conducted using the DNA recovered from the K-bar knife sheath and the DNA recovered from defendant's parents' trash. Information related to the STR DNA analysis conducted using the DNA recovered from the K-bar knife sheath and the DNA recovered from defendant via a buccal swab.
We also get a whole lot more information about exactly what happened and how they tracked down the DNA match in this case. In this case, investigators used IGG to begin the process of developing a lead to the individual who left DNA on the K-bar knife sheath The Idaho State Police utilized a private laboratory to develop an SNP profile from the DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. The private laboratory started using genetic genealogy to develop a family tree, but after law enforcement decided the FBI would take over, the private laboratory ceased its efforts and sent the SNP profile to the FBI. The FBI uploaded the SNP profile to one or more publicly available genetic genealogy services to identify possible family members of the suspect based on shared genetic data. The FBI could then view through the Genetic Genealogy Services portal information regarding potential relatives of the suspect who left DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. Based on information the FBI could see in the Genetic Genealogy Services portal, the FBI went to work building family trees of the genetic relatives to the suspect DNA left at the crime scene in an attempt to identify the contributor of the unknown DNA. The FBI built the family tree using the same tools and methods used by members of the public who wished to learn more about their ancestors. For example, the FBI consulted social media, viewed vital records such as birth and death certificates, and viewed other information already contained in the user portal for the Genetic Genealogy Service, including unverified information submitted by other users of the Genetic Genealogy Service. The FBI also consulted subscription-based databases available to law enforcement for information on individual people. The product of the genealogy conducted by the FBI was a family tree that contained the name, birth date, and death date, if applicable, of hundreds of relatives, as well as their familial connections between each other and the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. The FBI then sent to local law enforcement a tip to investigate defendant. So we're seeing behind the scenes how the FBI stepped in to really help spearhead the investigative genetic genealogy in this case. And obviously, it seems like it was a game changer.
Yeah, it really made a huge difference.
Yes. And we all know that, I think in this case, the DNA is going to be a pretty difficult hurdle for Kohberger to overcome. There's been a lot made of his lack of connection with the victims in this case, right? That's something that his defense team is saying. He's not connected to these people. Why would he do it? But when you have DNA then on the knife sheath next to Madison Mogen's body, that's It's
difficult to explain that away. If you want a jury to acquit Kohberger, you're going to have to come up with a compelling explanation for how exactly his DNA got on the knife sheath by her body. And I think that's a tough needle to thread.
And basically, the prosecutor is arguing for this protective order based on Idaho court rules, essentially. They're saying that the rule that is important here, Rule 16, does not require disclosure of investigative genetic genealogy information, and that the information that came out of this does not tend to negate guilt or reduce potential punishment. So it says it's basically not applicable for this rule. Here's actually an interesting nugget that I found within this document. First, the IgG information is not material to the preparation of the defense. Defendant is charged with killing 4 people, not with being related to a particular person. The mere fact that uploading the completed SMP profile into a publicly available genetic genealogy service led law enforcement to relatives of defendant does not affect the strength of the evidence against him. The strength of the evidence against defendant in terms of DNA evidence depends upon the confirmatory result from the STR DNA analysis between defendant's DNA profile and the DNA recovered from the K-bar knife sheath. As explained further below, the state intends to introduce the STR DNA analysis at trial and does not intend to enter any evidence pertaining to the development of an SMP profile or the tree building process for inculpatory purposes. So what I take them to be saying there is essentially, we're not even going to use this at trial. So the DNA evidence that's going to be used at trial is directly between him and what we found on the knife sheath. All this stuff with investigative genetic genealogy was a way for us to hone in on him and, was a way for us to kind of go all in on him and kind of identify him and start figuring that out. But it essentially is immaterial.
Yeah, and I can certainly understand that argument. It certainly makes some sense. But on the other hand, it's like when you do a math problem in school, the teacher always says, I want to see your work. And so what the defense is doing here is we just don't want to see the end results, these end results that you say prove our client guilty. We want to know each step of the way how you got those results. And even if this is work you're not going to show in court, certainly the results of that work you're going to show in court. And so that makes it worthy of examination. And I think that argument is also quite compelling.
Yeah,
what do you think?
I think it's compelling for the defense to say we want everything, and that even if you're not going to use it in court does not mean that, we should just kind of check it off or pass it over. Now, the defense did have a response to these motions around investigative genealogy. Oh, and I should also mention that in this portion is where they sort of drop the bombshell about additional male profiles. And this is, of course, Ann Taylor for the defense. The state has provided information related to this request for the seized item, the knife sheath only. The defense has requested all DNA profiles, including 3 additional unidentified male DNA profiles developed during the course of law enforcement investigation. This information has not been supplied. The state has not provided all emails, text messages, electronic messages, or other messages and conversations regarding biological testing in this investigation. This request has been partially complied with. The response lacks the full scope of the request 6 months before and 6 months after testing related to this investigation. Further information relating to all lab personnel has not been provided.
I think, as you indicate, that the biggest bombshell there is the presence of other DNA profiles. And obviously, these profiles could be absolutely meaningless in the effort to find out who is responsible for these crimes. A lot of people go in and out of these college houses. So there's many innocent explanations for how that DNA could get there. But at the same time, those DNA profiles could be absolutely crucial. I would be very interested in exactly where in the house were these DNA profiles recovered. Have they identified these people? I think it's very worthwhile for the defense to try to get answers to all of those questions. And if they do identify who those people are, ask them why exactly they were in the house.
If they haven't already, right?
Yes.
And yeah, it seems, definitely going to be something that the defense is going to play up and the prosecution is going to play down. Now, here's yet another argument from the defense around this subject of DNA. The state apparently thinks that they need not explain how they came to think that it was Mr. Kohberger's DNA on the sheath. Presumably, the defense is expected to accept at face value that the sheath had touched DNA just waiting for testing by all the FBI's myriad resources. Additionally, the defense is to guess whether the state focused its investigation on Mr. Kohberger via a bizarrely complex DNA tree experiment or through its faulty identification of the vehicle involved in this case. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Mr. Kohberger does not accept that his defense does not need this information. It rather obviously falls within the ambit of Rule 16b-4 and 5, a fact the state's briefing makes clear in its kitchen sink approach to their briefing. The state begins their argument claiming Rule 16 has no interest in IgG testing, and then ends their argument claiming that somehow people will stop sharing their genetics if they were to realize the government is watching. Both arguments must fail. To begin with, the state apparently only wants to prevent Mr. Kohberger from seeing how the IgG profile was created and how many other people the FBI chose to ignore during their investigation. In essence, the state argues that if the later STR testing is accurate, then there is no reason to concern ourselves with how the state came to investigate Mr. Kohberger. What the state's argument asks this court and Mr. Kohberger to assume is that the DNA on the sheath was placed there by Mr. Kohberger, and not someone else during an investigation that spans hundreds of members of law enforcement and apparently at least one lab the state refuses to name. So to me, it seems like they're sort of trying to raise the specter of, somebody planted his DNA there. Is that what you're reading?
I think they're just wanting to get all the details they can about how exactly these testing procedures were done and carried out. And I think that's reasonable. The odds are that it was all carried out in a scientifically acceptable and very careful fashion. But the defense would be derelict in their responsibilities to their client if they didn't take steps to confirm that every step of the way, in my opinion.
Makes sense. You know, one thing that's been interesting is that, again, in media coverage of this case, you'll see a lot of headlines, you know, defense claims no connection between Kohberger and the victims. And they're basically saying that the car and the DNA are weak evidence. But I think it would actually be a lot better for Kohberger if he had, you know, been friends with somebody in the house and would have had a reason to leave his DNA there. That's just my opinion. Because it's easy if he's known to the people and he's hanging out there and they find some of his DNA somewhere, you could say, well, he was there all the time. He would have had a reason.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. If he doesn't know them, there's no innocent explanation for why he would be in that house.
Right. Unless we want to get into, frankly, conspiratorial territory where, you know, you have some crime scene tech who's going around trying to frame random PhD students, which seems like a stretch.
Or if you want to go into, again, wild country, you could say that perhaps he gave his knife to someone for some innocent purpose in his mind, and that person wore gloves and used it in the commission of the crime.
Right. Which seems hard to fathom.
Either the DNA was planted there, which seems very unlikely, or Kohberger was there. You have to have some sort of explanation for the DNA belonging to Kohberger to be present if you want him to be acquitted.
So it just seemed very weird to me that they kept on hammering at that element of it, because it's like, that's the reason why this is so suspicious, is that his DNA is at the scene. It'd be a lot less suspicious if he was a boyfriend or a trusted friend who might have been there for some reason. Now, you know, one thing we've been throwing around a lot is some DNA terminology that I wanted to clarify for a moment. So we've heard a lot about STR DNA. What is that? Okay, STR stands for short tandem repeat analysis. Now, what does that mean? It's basically a type of DNA profiling. It was used in this to find a statistical match between Kohberger and the DNA sample that was collected from the Ka-Bar knife sheath. Here are the numbers that prosecutors threw around in their filing. The STR profile is at least 5.37 octillion times more likely to be seen if the defendant is the source than if an unrelated individual randomly selected from the general population is the source. Octillion, that's a lot of zeros. They are very much, you know, saying that this DNA matches him. We are so delighted to work with our sponsor, Brilliant Earth. This is a company that offers some of the most brilliant and romantic engagement rings and wedding bands out there, all the while ensuring a commitment to ethical sourcing and sustainability.
If you're looking to get married or to become engaged, or even if you're just searching for a special piece of fine jewelry, you have to check out their website. They make browsing so easy.
They even let you design your own perfect engagement ring, or you can shop by style. I love the delicate willow rings, along with the 3-stone Nadia rings and the classic freesia rings. It's so hard to choose.
And you don't have to worry about the ethical implications of your purchase. Your special gift, your engagement ring, your wedding band should never be tarnished by the idea that the gems or materials came from an abusive system.
See, Brilliant Earth has a commitment to beyond conflict-free diamonds. That means one thing. They only accept diamonds from mining operations in countries that strictly follow international labor, trade, and environmental standards. Fewer than 1% of other diamond suppliers meet Brilliant Earth standards.
You can feel good about your purchase, knowing that you're supporting a brand that actually cares about its ethical impact and is committed to fostering better standards in the jewelry business.
Check out all of their beautiful pieces at brilliantearth.com. That's brilliantearth.com. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. HelloFresh really wants you to have it all. Free time and fresh, tasty food. That's why they take care of all the meal planning and deliver the ingredients so everything you need to whip up a delicious meal arrives right to your door. We love the convenience of getting high-quality, pre-measured ingredients shipped right to our door so we can have the fun of cooking meals together in the kitchen without the pressure of worrying about whether or not we have all the items we need.
And let me stress that when we say high-quality ingredients, we really mean it. The last time I was in the grocery store, some of the produce I saw looked like it had been sitting out for weeks. And that is frustrating because this is the peak time for summer produce. Well, HelloFresh makes sure that their ingredients travel from the farm to your front door in less than 7 days. And when something is that fresh, it simply tastes better.
This is another great reason to try out HelloFresh. And remember, Murder Sheet listeners get a special discount.
Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet50 and use code MSheet50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Find out why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
So now we can get into another major development in this case that is sort of been talked about much like DNA for quite some time preceding to this latest batch of filings, and that's the death penalty. Now, as we've discussed in the past, Idaho is a death penalty state. That being said, it's rarely carried out there. To give you a sense of the size of the state's death row, according to the Idaho Department of Corrections website, there are currently only 8 people on death row in the state. So it's not a sizable population. And since 1977, only 3 executions have actually occurred. So that's what I mean when I say it's relatively rare. It's rare to have things go to that point.
And one thing that tells us is that it must be very difficult in Idaho to get someone onto death row and to get them actually executed. It must be a very difficult process. And so that tells us it's probably not something you would undertake to do unless you were very confident.
To give you a sense, the last time we saw an execution in Idaho was, according to Law and Crime, in 2012. And that inmate was Richard Albert Levitt. So that's over 10 years ago.
What did Levitt do?
So in 1984, a woman named Danette Jean Elg was discovered murdered. She had been brutally stabbed to death. Her sexual organs were slashed up and removed. And previously, she had told the police that this guy, Levitt, was trying to break into her house. There was a circumstantial case against him. He had been cut very badly on the night of the murder on his hand. His blood matched blood at the crime scene. And he was executed via lethal drug injection. And he basically had a history of being an extremely violent person. He was a suspect in multiple rapes. He was known to frequently threaten women. And he was actually the person to report his victim missing in this case. He claimed to police that he was just worried about her, but, that's just a disgusting and horrifying case. So he's the last person executed. It's not very common in Idaho. But of course, this is one of the big cases that Idaho has seen in recent years. The Vallow Daybell case has also been pretty big, but, the senseless stabbing murder of 4 young University of Idaho students. I mean, these kids had their lives all in front of them. They, are killed in their beds when they, it's every parent's worst nightmare. It's every college student's worst nightmare. It's just a horrific case that impacted the community. So it does make some sense that they would be going for the death penalty in this. I also imagine that from a purely strategic standpoint, a death penalty being on the table is a bargaining chip, right?
Yes.
So how can that factor into a prosecutor's decision to go for the death penalty.
Well, in some cases, you can file for the death penalty. And then in the plea bargaining process, you can say, well, if your client pleads guilty, we'll take the death penalty off the table.
So it can be a way to get people into some sort of plea.
Yes.
Right. If they're afraid to die. So that's another thing here we should keep in mind. I mean, one thing I should note is that death penalty cases are incredibly expensive, and because of things like automatic appeals, they can stretch on for a very long time. That's when, from the victim's family's perspective, that can be a downside. But I know that at the very least, members of the Gonsalves family have come out in favor of Kohberger being executed if found guilty. So it seems like at least with one family, there is a support for that course of action. So a couple of other just kind of housekeeping things, I would say other filings concern Kohberger asking for grand jury materials, and there kind of being some back and forth with the prosecutor on that, and the judge weighing in. But in general, what are we seeing from Kohberger in terms of strategy for his team? Well, I think one big element is probably going to be the additional DNA. Who are these other three males? What's their story? Could they be a better suspect than him? We've also seen the defense kind of focus on basically asking for some more time, is how I would characterize it. They're basically saying, we're having to review all this discovery. We want this pushed back. We want that pushed back. And we're not really seeing the state object to that or anything. So I think there's a certain element of they're getting inundated with information right now. And we may see more concrete things emerge as things go on. But, you know, definitely in the mode of sort of like, give us everything and give us time to look at everything. Which seems prudent. Because I'm going to tell you, I mean, some of these pieces of evidence against Kohberger are would be pretty concerning, I imagine, for the defense. And so having time to look at that, figure out a strategy on dealing with that, especially with the stakes so high on a death penalty case. And just as a notice that regarding when we talk about the death penalty in this case, we're talking about how the prosecutors filed a notice of intent to seek the death penalty. That doesn't necessarily mean that things will come to that, as we talked about plea deals. And of course, you know, the jury will have to also be on board with that decision. Basically, a lot of times a death penalty decision can come down to things like mitigating factors, right, Kevin, or aggravating factors.
Yes. Mitigating factors are, of course, things that in theory make the offense seem less serious. Aggravating factors are things which make it seem worse. If you commit like a vicious robbery for no reason because you don't need to steal anything, and you go out of your way to commit harm to people who pose no threat to you, like perhaps children or something, those would be aggravating factors. Mitigating factors would be things that minimize what you do in some way. Perhaps you're impoverished. Perhaps you have some sort of history of being abused and such. So those are things that would be considered.
Absolutely. Now, as of right now, the trial date is set for October 2nd, 2023. So that's coming up pretty fast. And we're looking at, I believe, media reports have indicated that the principals believe this may be like a 6-week trial. So this is going to be a long trial. It's coming up. I don't know whether there'll be further delays due to discovery issues and kind of getting all of that together. But at the very least, it's looming on the horizon at this point.
Yeah, it's fast approaching. Of course, there's always the possibility that it could be delayed, but we just have to wait and see. Yeah,
and we'll wait to cover future developments in this case and continue looking at what's going on at the various hearings and with the various filings. We want to thank everybody who is interested enough in our coverage of this case to encourage us to keep covering it. And thanks so much for your feedback, first of all. And thanks for listening, second of all. And we'll keep on this and just keep on sending us your questions, and we'll try to get into the various topics that you want us to cover in future discussions about this case.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly like think about ingredients, and we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen. But HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are, because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear, so like you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code msheet16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much